there should be a subcommittee that addresses this issue. On the one hand, our feeling was this is a moment that we cannot lose. There is a particular point in time right now, and it's important to step up and carry the ball and not ignore the issues that obviously need to be addressed to improve criminal justice in our society. However, Reggie had a concern that if the state was going to go ahead and commission a group to address racial inequality in the criminal justice system, it would be resourced differently than this group. Its composition certainly would have been different than the Criminal Justice Reform Commission. And he had a concern, and I think we're hearing elements of that if we do the job ineffectively, is that potentially worse than doing nothing at all? And so I think there's this tension. And so on the one hand, I feel really strongly that we can't let this moment in history go, but that we need to do more than just check the box. And so I'm wondering if there is a way to communicate the concerns that there's a lot more work to be done, that we have just scratched the surface, that more needs to be done, maybe a separate commission, but that we've just started scratching the surface. But in this brief surface exploration, here are the issues that we're coming up with. And so I'm wondering if there's a way to achieve both objectives, to clearly state we need to address issues of racial inequality in the criminal justice system, that this is something that is, whether we want to expressly address it or not, it's embedded in the issues that the commission at large is addressing, but that there's so much more that needs to be done. Here's some of the issues, but that more needs to be done. And so I'd like to see if there's a way to achieve both objectives.
Okay. So we've got, I'm not sure, competing interests here, but certainly the unanimity I'm hearing is that something needs to be issued. If nothing else, to acknowledge that we met and discussed. The question is whether we water it down to the point that no false inference can be drawn from it that substantive work was done, or do we punch it up more and say more explicitly, these are the things we talked about vis-a-vis race in the system, et cetera, and add some more detail to it. And I'll be candid with you, to Melanie's point. I was trying to be very generic here rather than put too much in, leading to the question, okay, well, what were your conclusions about these things when we, after two meetings, really just didn't have time to do that. So I guess I'll, again, kind of put it back to the group here. This was a rough draft. I've made a couple of changes. I've got a few other suggestions that are more substantive from a few folks who aren't going to be here today. I can get into that. Tabitha Owens wanted to make sure we acknowledge the specific difficulties for rural areas and lack of access to public defenders and things like that. And Jessica Glenn Denning had asked me for more, or we'd had more of a robust discussion about juvenile things. She wanted some more detail there, but I think that a little bit collateral to the comments so far. So the question is, do we want to punch this up and make it and be more explicit? Do we want to water it down and just say this is more of an update than a report? Simply a status call for the little bit of work that's been done, with the notice to the reader that we anticipate doing a great deal more. So that's the first thing. I think the second point, though, would be, that's been raised by a few of you, is do we think that this is an endeavor that this subcommittee should continue? Or should we simply say, am I hearing that some of you think a subcommittee within the Criminal Justice Reform Commission is not really the way to go? What they need is for the legislature to stand up a standalone race in the criminal justice system commission to work on a parallel track with the Reform Commission. Maybe I'm asking too much here, but I'm got the report to deal with, but also part and parcel of that report's going to be, what's our recommendation? We
Chairman,
disband the subcommittee or move on?
Sorry,
Yeah.
Chairman Bennett, this is Representative Owens.
Yeah.
I kind of like that idea that in lieu of making specific recommendations, our primary or our sole recommendation is that we met for a month or two. We weren't able to do a deep enough dive into the issues, and that our sole recommendation is that we stand up a committee that deals specifically with these issues. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I actually think there's a lot right with that. So just a thought from my perspective.
One other question in that regard for those of you who, Melanie and others who are on the governor's task force, is that, would that be seen as we're asking the legislature to go stand up a competing commission collateral to what the governor's already doing? Does that undermine your?
Co-chair of the Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice, I wouldn't see this as competing. I think that if we're asking the legislature to stand up a commission on racial equity and justice, we're asking for another perspective and further work that delves a bit deeper into legislative reforms. I would say that, I like what Representative Owens said of making our focus be that recommendation to the legislature. Though I still would say that we can point to other reports and other work that has been done, like the Pretrial Justice Commission and like the Governor's Commission, to say that some of this work has already been started. A legislative commission wouldn't need to reinvent the wheel, but they could use those reports as a way to further the efforts. It may be a way in which we see more legislative action take place.
Chairman Bennett, Representative Owens, again, just to add to that, excuse me, I think that it's worth noting here that the governor set up her subcommittee with her appointees from her perspective, right? There was no legislative involvement or legislative input. Being that the governor is a different party of the majority of the legislature, I don't think that it's duplicate. I think that it'll bring a host of different perspectives from the legislature, and that possibly, assuming the legislature agrees, leadership agrees to stand up this committee, the first thing that can happen is we get a full report from the governor's task force, because again, as I mentioned early on in the process, I was a bit disappointed that the governor didn't choose to use the Criminal Justice Reform Commission as that tool to study the race relations in more depth and set up her own. And so I think that there's a lot of benefit, is what I'm getting at, to having the legislature stand up its own committee to look at this.
Well, this is Co-Chair Portillo. I will just point out that the Governor's Commission is doing work beyond criminal justice reform. So our first charge is to look at criminal justice reform, and we'll put that report out on December 1st. But our commission will stay in place through 2022. And
Awesome.
in the coming years, we will do work beyond criminal justice reform. So I hear what you're saying,
Great.
Representative Owens, but our charge will go beyond law enforcement and beyond criminal justice as a focus.
Excellent. And I very much look forward to seeing that report and appreciate the work that you guys are doing. So thank you for sharing that with me.
Thank you.
Any counterpoint or any disagreement with the notion that this final, I guess we haven't reached consensus yet on whether or not we do a report, but so far what I'm hearing is something needs to be put together. So with that understanding, is there any counterpoint to the notion that in our final update / report that we say, here's what we've been, here's what we've discussed, here's recognition of, or draw attention to the work of others, and specifically this, Karen Oliver Berger's bail reform, and et cetera. And oh, by the way, at the end, in conclusion, we think this is an important enough issue for the state that a standalone race in the criminal justice system equity commission ought to be established by the legislature, and that would be our formal recommendation to the legislature. Anyone disagree with that approach? Anyone think that we ought to just that this subcommittee should continue to exist insofar as the commission exists next year if we get another year? Anyone disagree with this point of view? Okay. All right. Well, then let's So I think, so the first point that was made was Mr. McCormick pointed out that he thought maybe we hadn't done enough yet to even issue a report. We'll get to that here momentarily, but I think insofar as we ultimately agree that we should, what I'm hearing everybody say then is that we should recommend at least that the independent commission be established. I suppose, by February, March, if that has not happened, then we'll have to make a decision whether or not we want to continue to take up the mantle, again, assuming the Reform Commission is reestablished or given additional life by the legislature. But we'll have to cross that bridge when we get there. There's no way to plan ahead for that necessarily. So back to the report itself.
Mark,
yeah.
This is Melody Brandon. I want to add a point. If we do make that recommendation of a sort of standalone committee, that we include a recommendation about who should be on it. And that if we're going to have prosecutors and law enforcement, that there needs to be parity and access for public defense, because that's been a real problem. There are no public defenders on the pretrial task force. There are no public defenders on the racial justice and equity. And so I think specifically asking for that would be a place that we can make some real progress. Let's see, I don't have it. I could find it, but it'd take me a minute. There was a checklist. There was a litany of entities that had to be represented on the Criminal Justice Reform Commission by statute. I can disseminate that and ask for additional suggestions. But as you say, public defender, that was something that was left off initially, and we added them so that we've got a public defender part of our commission now. Private counsel, judges, they're different, and also regional. I think that's important in this state since we have such a dichotomy between urban and rural. But yeah, I don't disagree. I don't know that names are appropriate, but right. represent this entity, represent public defenders, represent private counsel, represent, yeah. Exactly.
Sounds good to me. And I can, we're not going to come up with a final report today. I'll come up with suggestions and I'll tweak it and then disseminate it for a final vote and then move it on to the commission. So that can be included in the final round. That work for everybody?
Yeah, Chairman Bennett, this is Mark McCormick again, just to clarify. Melody and John brought up a couple of issues that were more eloquently rather than put out a report that we didn't really believe in. It would be better to not issue anything. I am open to options as we've discussed here today, but what Melody and John said in particular really speak to what my concerns were. And I also appreciate what Co-Chair Portillo said as well about the need for putting something on the record. But again, rather than putting out a report that we didn't believe in deeply, I thought it would be better to not put out a report, just to clarify.
Mr. Chief Ackerman, I would agree with Mr. McCormick that there's so much work to be done, and it's hard to even paraphrase in a small report like this what we're actually thinking. I'm not opposed to an actual standalone commission, as long as it's equally represented. I got no problem at all with that. But I think to due diligence, we need to submit something to show that these are the points. We know there's a lot of work to do, but it's not going to be done. We'd be lucky if we can get it done in a year. It just, there's so much to do. And I would agree with that as well, but we got to give them something, or I don't think we're doing our job. So
to that end, based on what Chief just said and Ms. McCormick just said, seems to me then that maybe put it in the two ways: water it down, punch it up. I'm thinking maybe what I'm hearing the consensus is that we got to give them something, but it can be something as simple as here's simply an update. It's not a report, because a report at least tends to imply that we've reached some degree of conclusion, and all we've concluded is that this hasn't been enough time, and we probably this needs a full attention of a standalone commission. I could change a few points here. So at the beginning,
2020 update as opposed to report. Semantics, but it does speak to the issue I think has been raised. Goals, I mean, we talk about the fact that we tried to identify some goals, and then the real point is the discussion points on data. I've made a change that here that was suggested to me earlier, but I understand the discussion with being a little less effectual than some had wanted. I could just strike that first full paragraph, only add the part that's in yellow from the second draft, just say that the ultimate report to be issued by the Governor's Commission will have specific recommendations regarding data collection, or this subcommittee recognizes the work done by the Racial Equity and Justice Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice, excuse me, and we'll look to their specific recommendations in their December 1, 2020 report, something like that, just to acknowledge the work of that other. Bail reform, acknowledge the work of Karen Arnold Berger. Public defender, acknowledge the work of I think some of you have seen the 90-page report that the new executive director has put out from the bids, and acknowledge the work there. Post-incarceration, there's not a lot to, there's not another entity to give, acknowledgement to. Juvenile justice, sort of the same thing. I mean, we could punch those up, but I get the impression that that's really not where the majority wants to go. And since I'm not enough, I just don't think that's what I'm hearing. And again, police reform, same way. All we can do is give lip service to things. And then in the conclusion section, simply say that the subcommittee's recommendation is that the legislature stand up its standalone commission during the 2021 session. And we would recommend that it be populated by representatives of the following institutions, organizations, whatever, and then come up with a laundry list of folks that we think need to be represented there. Is that sort of crystallize the conversation? Anybody disagree with that approach?
No, I don't disagree at all with this, Chief Ackerman. It's like we talked in the beginning, Mark, that this is going to become the time where whoever gets handed this is going to have to sit down and make the hard decisions, have those hard arguments, and it can't be done in this short amount of time. And it wouldn't do anybody any justice. And I think more time either to an independent commission, or if they allow us to continue, either way. But I think we're on the right track there, Mark.
Well, to that point, I might even suggest that in the final paragraph, we tell them, we suggest that at least 3 years. I mean, maybe someone disagrees, maybe more, but don't limit. If they're going to go to the trouble of putting this commission together, they shouldn't limit it until 1 or 2 years. I don't know how you could do a top to bottom assessment and make substantive changes that I think everybody on this commission, or recommendations that everybody on this commission would want to see them do if they just gave them a 1 year window. So.
I would leave it open if it was me. I mean, they may decide to make it the way things are going, make it a permanent commission.
Yeah.
They could do what they want.
Back to the way I suggested, making these changes, kind of, scrapping the stuff we haven't had enough meat on the bone, acknowledging the other work of other entities, making the final recommendations for a standalone commission. Is that working for everybody, or anybody have a different point of view?
This is Margie Phelps with the Kansas Department of Corrections. I don't have a different view. I just want to add one point. Whatever body is formed, that we could identify the need to have the voice of those who are justice involved and impacted by these various recommendations. There might be some sources that folks can come forth with for some representatives of that voice.
Okay. Good point. Melody, did we say something a minute ago? Or go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's like Chief Ackerman here again. It's just like this committee here. They can form their commission, but we can have ad hoc members too and brought in as needed. I would agree. Everybody should have a voice in this. It's going to be a huge impact. I don't care what side you're on or who you're talking about. And I think they ought to leave that open to bring in extra people for advice or expertise.
Melody, Professor Francis, Mark McCormick, folks who've weighed in so far, Portia, anybody else want to chime in on this?
Mark, this is Melody, just so I understand. So part of the revision would be basically to take out numbered paragraphs 4, 5, and 6 and say that we've discussed those topics and they need more exploration, but we're not making any particular recommendations. Is that right?
Unless you got a difference of opinion, yes.
I think that's a good way to handle that.
And then tweak 1, 2, and 3 to, well, 2 actually I think is okay, but 1 and 3 we could make reference to those other organizations.
Yeah.
Mark McCormick, Professor Francis, any counterpoints to that? Are we getting to the heart of the concerns raised by the two of you? Or Shannon?
Yeah, I don't have a counterpoint. It's just that we need to fully acknowledge as a body how difficult it is to talk about race in our society. John mentioned Reggie earlier. I used to work with Reggie at the Kansas Leadership Center. And we used to talk about case in point, which is this theory that all the problems that exist out in society exist in any given room. And when you look at our discussions, we've had difficulty centering race, even having discussions about race. And it was just difficult for me to understand how we would produce a report from discussions that did not fully center race. And would our doing that, would we be derelict in our duty? So it was for that reason that I raised this issue at the beginning of the meeting. And I appreciate you giving me time to explain.
Yeah, no problem. Well, I would say the only thing I would say is I think it is difficult, but I think the people in this subcommittee are up to the task. I think we were in hindsight, the one thing I would do different is I wish we could have stood this subcommittee up a year ago. We could have had more time to get through those. I was trying to find something we could grab a hold of and have some degree of small consensus on, so we'd have something to put out, but it wasn't much meat on the bone. I acknowledge that. And so if it seemed like it was less than a robust conversation, that may be a bit of a product of how late we got started with this. But given the deadline, we had that December 1 deadline looming. But I certainly understand your point. Professor Francis, Shannon, or anyone else want to weigh in on this? A proposal?
Yes, John Francis, Washburn Law. Thank you, Mr. Chair. In terms of people to include in a recommendation for a standalone commission, I think it would be really important to include someone or maybe multiple people from the public education system. I think that would be a group that could address the concern about school to prison pipeline. I'd also like to pick up on the thread that Mark McCormick just mentioned, which is just to acknowledge the difficulty of having frank, meaningful discussions about race. And even in this group where this is our purpose for doing this, I think we're all parsing our words very carefully. We're trying to be cognizant to not say something that's going to be provocative, but still address the issues. And it is difficult. And first of all, Mark, thank you for bringing that up, because I really do think that is something that is just difficult. It's difficult to talk about race. I think because of that, sometimes it's also difficult to talk about issues within the criminal justice system that can impact just or unjust outcomes. And I think one of those issues is the role of policing in this. And I think because it's difficult to talk about issues of race, sometimes it's difficult to talk about issues surrounding policing and the impact that has had. And I think because we want to be careful about it, sometimes we just don't address it. And when we look at the events that occurred that prompted us to say we need this commission, these evolved out of incidents involving police and public. And so I think that it would be worthwhile to mention in the report that we recognize not just the role of policing is one of many issues to address, but that it is a major issue that we need to address here. And when I'm saying this, I don't mean any disrespect to our colleagues in the subcommittee who are in law enforcement. I do not walk in your shoes. I cannot imagine how difficult your job is. But I also want to be frank about this and just lay out there that I think we need to address the role of policing and the potential impact that it has on matters of racial injustice.
And I would just add to what Mark and John have said about how difficult it is for people to talk about these issues. And I almost wonder whether, I don't know if this goes into a report, but it seems to me that any group that is like this, that is talking about issues that are so, emotional and difficult, it seems like a moderator or somebody that is experienced in basically getting people to get to the heart of an issue and really talk about it without really having any, bias one way or another, would be helpful to a group of people that were trying to at least delve into these issues. And I don't know how you put that in a report. I don't know if you get, and then you get into, does that cost something to have someone come in? Because you want someone that's really experienced at that level to do that sort of thing.
It's interesting, the actual Criminal Justice Reform Commission was, when it was stood up, so we mentioned Reggie Robinson, that was his identified role, was as a, can't remember if I was looking here again, it's in my stack of stuff here. I can't remember if they call him moderator or, I don't know, somebody may remember the term of art.
Facilitator.
So facilitator, thank you. To do essentially what you're describing, Judge. So that's not without precedent. You're not off the norm there when you suggest that. So good point. I think it would be handy to have somebody to, now who that would be, I don't know exactly, but that's where the policymakers get to put that into play. But yeah, good point. Someone else was going to say something?
This is Shannon Portillo. I just want to say thank you, Judge Rios, for that comment. I think one of the difficulties when it comes to discussions of race, racism, systemic inequality, and institutionalized racism that is a part of many of our criminal justice institutions is that we're often not starting with the same definitions. So it's not just an area that is difficult to talk about, but it's something where we actually don't have the shared knowledge to have these conversations in a productive way, because we're often coming with our own individual lived experiences, but we haven't spent a lot of time kind of talking about shared terms, the history of these concepts in many different areas of our work. And so I do think that one thing that would be really productive is if we're going to make a recommendation for a future commission is a discussion of how not only is the conversation facilitated, but how do we create a foundation for that conversation where we're coming to this with shared knowledge and shared terms so that we can really talk about not just race, but racism and systemic inequality. We're not here to discuss differences, but we're here to really address the inequalities that have been a part of many of our systems.
Do you, just clarify then, you want us to, you suggesting that we try to come up with some suggested definitions, racial inequity, we're talking about racial equity we're seeking here, so define inequity, or just suggesting that when it stood up, those things need to be thought about.
I think when it stood up, those things need to be thought about. And if we're looking at a facilitator, I mean, Reggie Robinson was a mentor to so many and sounds like had a number of really amazing relationships with folks on the subcommittee. And I had the honor of working for him for quite a while. And one of the things he did really well was set the stage for discussions. And so I think what we're asking here is to have someone work with the committee who can really set a solid foundation of making sure that they're speaking from areas of shared definition. So there's some background discussion before jumping into recommendations.
I would agree
Chairman
with
Bennett. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Chairman Bennett. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Judge. I'm sorry, Judge. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was simply going to say I agree with Shannon about coming to the table with speaking the same language to begin with. That's very important.
Chairman Bennett, Adrian Robertson. I love the way this discussion is going, but I would like to add a caveat to that. This is all great and good, but then I think there needs to be a solid foundation as to why and what's the purpose. Now, we're talking about definitions. We're talking about having those technical things in place, but for what purpose? And as every one of us in this conversation, because these types of conversations could go to places that could get people off track. However, if there is a solid reason as to why we're having these deep, daunting conversations, it keeps the purpose in the focus. It'll keep people in what we call the productive zone to keep moving forward, because these conversations will get emotional. It will trigger, and it's going to allow people to, it's going to allow us as a group to find out people's true values, people's true intent, and their true loyalties. However, there has to be a solid why, because I know Ed O'Malley talks about that all the time. If you don't have a solid purpose, you'll be all over the place. So
What's the, so to call the question, then the purpose that we're going to hand this off.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, there has to be a solid understanding of why this group needs to have this conversation, like Judge Rios is saying, and Ms. Portillo and everyone else is saying. Why are we doing this?
And make sure we don't miss an opportunity here. Reverend, do you have a suggestion in terms of what that goal is that we're asking the legislature to stand this committee up to achieve? What is that goal?
That would have to be a group. I could give my interpretation, but that would have to be a group consensus as to why we're doing this. And so that's why I'm putting that out there, because of the nature of this tough adaptive conversation. I'm just using KLC language, but my interpretation might not be the whole groups. And so there needs to be some work there as to why are we doing this hard work. So I just wanted to put that out there, because I think what you're talking about is very needed for this group.
The reason I asked the question, though, is not to put you on the spot, but just to say the way this process will work is we'll make this recommendation. It'll end up in the report. The individual legislators will see this and go, I agree. I want to be the guy, the gal that sponsors that piece of legislation. And that legislation gets a number, goes to committee, they hear discussion. And at that point, it'll have a life of its own, is what I'm getting at. This group will have no role in what the stated goals may be. Now, even if we came up with something that we chiseled into granite right now, they could still ignore it down the road. I mean, it's the legislature will do what they're going to do. But that's why I asked the question, if there's something you want specifically, or just the point to make that we really highly recommend that not only members be assimilated but that a specific purpose be identified by the policymakers in Topeka, so that this group knows what their charge is. I mean, is that really what you're getting at? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Something that's going to cause them to move. Yes, sir. Not just some pie in the sky, but we're doing this because we need for you to recognize this situation at this level so that they will move.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chair.
Yep.
Chief Ackerman, I would agree with Mr. Robertson. It's when people start looking at racial committees and they see badges on this committee. And we were already told once in the beginning there's way too much law enforcement representation. I couldn't disagree more. If you take any good police administrator right now, we wouldn't be sitting on these committees if we did not believe there needs to be reform. We know there are. Times have changed. We need to get rid of certain things, certain people, certain instances that have happened. We need to change with that. I would agree with him that we all need to be on the same goal, same platform starting out. Because if we're not on the same goal or platform starting out, we're shooting ourselves in the foot already. If we can get the right goal, and if you get police administrators like the two of us that are on today on board with our associations, really, where can you go but up from there? This is why I think it's vitally important that we have a role in this to get the buy-in. I mean, would you rather have buy-in, or would you like to have 50 chiefs sitting there arguing with the legislature? It makes no sense. It's counterproductive. This way, we can all have buy-in. If we can all, we might even have to fully agree on everything, but we got to be able to at least agree on what's the best for the state of Kansas. Do I really care what's going around the rest of the world? Yeah, we watch it, we monitor it, but we need to figure out what's best for the state of Kansas. And I believe that as law enforcement, we need to make sure we have a role in that as well to make sure it happens the right way.
All right, well, I don't want to cut off any discussion here, but I want to make sure that when we wrap this up, everyone's points of view have been heard here. What I've got for myself is I'm going to work on this report, or I'm going to update, excuse me, tweak a few things, as Melody Brannon mentioned earlier, tweaking 1 and 3, leaving 2 as is, getting rid of 4, 5, and 6 with maybe just a reference to the fact that they were discussed, but nothing substantive could be achieved in a short amount of time. As to the conclusions or final recommendations, it's for the commission. The commission that we're going to ask to be stood up, we've asked for certain very specific things, a facilitator / moderator. Judge Rios's recommendation, which I think everybody's fully embraced. We identify certain specific members, as Ms. Brannon has mentioned, and then up to and including Ms. Phelps' recommendation as folks who've been involved in the system need to have a voice at the table as well. I'll put out that may be one that'll probably require the most amount of tweaking. I'll try to come up with a list using some of what we've had in the past and then pass that around, see if there's something that's glaringly omitted, or not even glaringly, just an omission, we can fix that. Suggest, as the Reverend Roberson said a moment ago, that the legislature, when they stand this up, not only identify members, but give them as specific a task as possible. In our criminal justice reform, they literally gave us 5 or 6 goals, which very much helped us in the beginning identify the subcommittees that were identified and stood up. So I'll work on that. That's what I'm hearing. The large. Well, that's what I'm hearing from everybody. Is there anything that's anyone disagree with this point of view? Want to tweak something? Have a different, take this in a different direction, or something I've missed here? Okay. Well, I think that's probably as much as the first agenda item was the report. And I think we've spent now 50 minutes discussing what that should look like. And I think I've said it a couple times, and I'm getting a consensus here then as to how we're going to go forward with this. That, I don't want to give short shrift to anything, but I think that gets us about as far as we can today. Now, I guess I should have thought of this earlier. Professor Francis had mentioned he and Bill Persinger exchanged some emails about having somebody talk to this group about the co-responder program that's been going on in Topeka, and giving some airtime to a member or somebody who could speak and tell us about that. Now, I'm still willing to do that, if nothing else, for the edification of the people on the call. However, what I'm hearing, I think the place we went today was not where I was expecting, but that's fine. That's what a robust discussion gets us, is takes us where we need to go, whether anybody anticipated it ahead of time or not. What I'm getting at, though, is if this subcommittee, let's assume the Justice Reform Commission gets another year, which we hope it will. Let's also assume that the legislature then takes us up and says, you know what, this is important enough. We are going to stand up a standalone racial equity commission, legislative commission, or legislative sponsored commission. And so this subcommittee, what I'm hearing people say, would not have a reason to exist moving forward. That mantle would be taken up by this new standalone commission. So what I'm getting at is there's lots of ifs here, but if all that were to come to pass, is there some utility in this body hearing from the folks about the Topeka co-responder program at this point? Professor Francis, don't mean to put you on the spot, but you were the one that suggested it. Any thoughts on this?
I think ultimately I would leave that up to the group and Ms. Russell. I think there's still value in hearing about it. it will certainly inform all of us as we move forward. Some of us are on the Criminal Justice Reform Commission anyway, and this information will help us as we get back to the larger body. But as we think about, the events that caused us to come together in this group in the first place, it has to do with events that unfold during certain encounters between members of the public and police. And my understanding, which is limited, of the co-responder program in Topeka is that it brings people who are specially trained to work with folks who are suffering from mental health issues. And it creates a different dynamic in the police-citizen encounter when there is a call about someone who's suffering from a mental health episode. And so even though we might not be in a position to take action on what Ms. Russell is here to talk about, I think it's certainly information that would benefit all of us, whether this subcommittee remains intact or whether this is just something that we take back to the commission at large, or as we go out to our daily lives. So I think there's value in it, but I also don't want to take up Ms. Russell's time if this conversation took a turn that we hadn't bargained for.
Having good information and access to good information is never a bad thing. So I just want to make sure no one had a difference of opinion. Everybody good with that? Give them a second to respond. Anybody disagree? Okay, well, and I'm gonna do this one last call here before we turn it over to Ms. Russell to give us an update, but I think we got 10, 15 minutes here to give her, and she can at least give us the size of what's going on there. And I'm sure if people had more, wanted to dig in deeper, they could do it. I know Wichita is doing the same thing. And I think places around the country are seeing a new way to talk about police reform. When you have people other than just cops responding to a scene, to a call, that's pretty substantive reform. So I'm curious to see how it's going. But before we move on, is there anything else that was not any stone left unturned on the report, on the update, and the other discussion we've already had? I'd make sure before we turn it over and move past it. Anything else anyone wanted to weigh in on? Okay, Ms. Russell, I trust you have not given up on us yet after 50 plus minutes. And I hear a voice, so I'm trusting that you laugh.
I am here, and I apologize for the video connectivity on my end. I'm having some challenges, so it'll just be my voice. I thank you guys for the invitation to provide some information today. And also thank you for the work that you're doing on these issues. Very, very important. And it feels good to see this work being done. So some information on the co-responder program here in Topeka and Shawnee County. We have been doing this at Vallejo Behavioral Health Care since about 2013. In 2014, we actually went full-time with it. What the program looks like is we have a mental health professional that is paired with a CIT, which stands for Crisis Intervention Team, trained police officer. And that pair, the mental health professional and the officer, respond to calls that come through 911 for people who are having mental health challenges. The goal of our team is to provide de-escalation, try to wrap that individual in mental health services, to divert them from going to jail, and to divert them from going to the state hospital on a potentially involuntary basis. Currently, our program has 4 co-responders. We operate Monday through Friday, first and second shift. That looks like 7 a.m. to about 11:30 p.m. And then on the weekend, we have coverage on Saturday and Sunday from about 10 a.m. to 11:30 p.m. We partner with the Topeka Police Department and the Shawnee County Sheriff's Office. The Topeka Police Department has a behavioral health unit. On that behavioral health unit are 2 full-time dedicated CIT officers. So those officers only respond to mental health calls. They are not working accidents or anything like that. They're only responding to mental health calls. And we get quite a few calls in the city and out in the county, Shawnee County, to keep them busy on their first and second shift. They work Monday through Friday. Our weekend co-responders then pair with patrol officers who have been trained in the CIT model to respond to calls out on the street for individuals with mental health challenges. We find that when we are working with individuals, our mental health professionals are dressed business casual. Our CIT officers are dressed in kind of a soft uniform. It's khakis and a polo. They do have their full duty belt and everything of that nature. They also drive, they don't drive a traditional black and white police car. They drive it's a modified police car. So it's just a blacked out SUV. And we find that when we approach individuals and we're using a mental health professional with a law enforcement officer, it helps to promote our client safety and then officer safety as well. People are feeling less intimidated just because of the implied power differential with law enforcement. It gives the individual a mental health professional to talk to who can help them access resources that might be possibly more appropriate than using 911, getting them engaged with those resources, also exploring how we can build like a natural support system for them. So maybe they're not using 911 for reasons that they might not need to. We really strive in the co-responder program to build our community partnerships. We are very aware that if our partners within the community don't buy into this model and they're not on board with it, then we don't have a program. We don't have a model. In our county, in our city here in Topeka, we have been very fortunate that we have a very amazing law enforcement that we work with, Chief Bill Cochran, who has been a real champion for mental health in our county and our city. And he has just promoted CIT, and it was, a project for him starting in about 2014 to really get that through his department. So we are very proud of the buy-in that we have found that our officers have had with CIT at the Topeka Police Department. We do also work with the Sheriff's Department, just not as often. They just don't get as many calls. The funding that we have for the co-responder program can sometimes be a challenge. We're not exactly sure all the time how we are going to fund the positions. This year, especially, we were in quite a pinch because prior to this year in 2020, we had received a grant from KDADS that funded our second shift co-responder position. And our first shift co-responder position was a three-way partnership split between the city of Topeka, Vallejo Behavioral Healthcare, and Shawnee County. So the grant again then paid for the second shift, but we were no longer able to receive those grant money. So we just weren't sure what we were going to do to be able to continue our program. However, our city council had asked that funds that the police department were receiving would be used for social work services, social services. So our police department elected to provide those funds to fund our co-responder team. So now our Topeka Police Department, the city of Topeka, is funding our second shift position and then both of our weekend positions. So we feel very fortunate to do that, Our diversion rate, we know that when our co-responders are engaged on a call, when either because officers have requested them or because they've gone out to the call with the officers, our diversion rate is at about 98% of diverting people from jail or the state hospital. And that's really, again, what we focus on. We do not want the jail to be the largest mental health provider for our consumers. We want to be the mental health provider for our consumers. So we very much focus on what we can do, how we can put things in place to divert individuals from going to jail. It's not always possible to divert someone from going to jail, but we sure do try the best that we can. Our partnership with law enforcement it's a work in progress. We definitely have different views, but what is so great is that we're able to have conversations about those views. We generally always have the same goal in mind. It's just usually how we're getting there is more of what we need to have the conversation about. So our program has really been able to strengthen that relationship. And I feel as though our community has really been able to feel that presence of CIT in the co-responder program here in Topeka. Does anybody have any questions or anything else? That was kind of the short and quick version.
Just, I want one question, this Mark Bennett, to divert people away from jail and away from involuntary commitment under Chapter 59 care and treatment cases. Diverting, I just want to make sure I get this right. Diverting them to what then? I mean, is it trying to get it home with caseworkers? Yeah, how's that?
Absolutely.
What resources do you have? I guess what I'm getting at.
You got it. So here in Topeka, we have the Crisis Center at Vallejo. We utilize that quite a bit. It's a voluntary facility. We have a crisis house. It's a 26-bed facility. However, right now, because of COVID, we're limited. So we're only at 16 beds. Luckily, we haven't gotten to the position where we've had to turn anybody away. We've been able to be creative. So we utilize our crisis center quite a bit in Topeka for diverting folks. We also look at how we can support them in the community, in their natural setting of home, with their family and case managers in the community. So we have crisis case managers at Vallejo that will refer them to. Those crisis case managers will visit with them daily if needed. The co-responders will also do follow-up with some of our high utilizers or people that are higher risk. Maybe they've been released from the state hospital, but they're not medication compliant. And so they have a high risk of going back to the state hospital. So yes, we use the resources that we have here at Vallejo, Case Management Crisis Center, again, trying to build up their natural support system to help keep them in their home.
Other questions, Ms. Russell?
Yeah, Ms. Russell, this is Chief Mosley. Is that program for the Topeka, Shawnee County, just the main within the city? And do you partner with any of the smaller jurisdictions?
So yeah, this is our program. It just covers Topeka and Shawnee County. And those 4 co-responders are accessible to the Sheriff's Department and City of Topeka PD. So we have a larger state board. It's called KCJRC, Kansas CIT Association, that we work with developing communities who do not have a CIT program established and helping them navigate how to do that. So the larger board for the state does a lot of that outreach in partnership with KDADS. But we here in Shawnee County and Topeka weekly are on the phone or having meetings with individuals in other counties developing those programs as well, just to kind of help.
Okay, thank you.
And we're always happy to do that. It's not a short process either, because again, you have to get a lot of buy-in from the community to do so.
Okay.
Anyone else? All right, Ms. Russell, I appreciate your time. I think it's not so much a novel concept anymore, that it's more of a allocation of resources. And if the communities are seeing where this is an improved way to have citizens who are in crisis have contact with law enforcement. I think the average cop would like to not be involved in these calls at all, but at the same time, it's kind of how too many of our governmental entities have not supported other mechanisms, and so we're stuck with cops going out to these calls. So if that's where it's going to be, social workers involved and people with mental health training involved, so hopefully the bad situations don't come to pass as often. So
Absolutely.
good work. Appreciate the update. I think, as Professor Francis said earlier, if nothing else, it's just good for us all to be aware of this and know that there's some forward-thinking communities that are giving these things a try. So thank you very much for your communication and your service.
Thank you, guys. Thank you again for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, ma'am. Take care. To the rest of the subcommittee members, anyone else have anything they want to bring to the attention of the group before we conclude?
I have something. I thought I was typing a message to everyone, and when we were talking earlier about, I can't recall who brought it. I think Mr. Roberson brought it up about what is our purpose. I don't know if this committee comes together again, or if a new committee is formed. I hope that we begin with a mission statement. I think Mr. Roberson was saying we need to know the why. I think you start with a mission statement, and then you have a person who could help us identify the language around the issues. I don't mean to go back into that again, but I thought everyone had received that message from me, but it just wanted to say it would be good to have a mission statement.
Okay. Also, Jordan did send me a copy of, I asked him to go ahead and forward it to everyone else, the commission members. I'm going to say there were, I won't count them here, 18 or 19, something like that, page and a half of them. Member of the Kansas Senate, a member of the House of Representatives, somebody from the judicial branch, just on and on, to give you a sense of what was, who was on the list of folks to be on the Reform Commission. You guys can take a look at that and make suggestions about who else would need to be, or may not need to be all the folks who are on this new Racial Equity Commission. I don't know, but it's a place to start. So there's that. Anything else from anyone else? All right. Well, I appreciate everybody's time. We've been at this for about an hour and 10 minutes. Thanks for giving us your lunch hour. If it comes to pass that the legislature takes us up on our suggestion that a standalone Racial Equity Commission is created and identified, and so a couple of people have said, and Chief Ackerman suggested, it's probably something that ought to have an open window. I don't know that a 1 or 2, or even as I suggest 3 years is enough for something like this. It's an important enough task that probably needs to be a standing commission, but that, obviously that's in the hands of the folks who have to stand it up. So at any rate, but if they do that, and then this subcommittee does not meet again, I would at least like to say thank you to everybody who gave us 3 or 4 hours of your time over the last 90 days to have these meetings, discuss these issues. And, we didn't get very far, but at the same time, I don't think it was wasted effort or wasted time. If nothing else, it showed the need for a more robust conversation in the state. So thank you all for your time and attention. And if there's a need for us to meet again, I'll let you know next, probably by the midpoint of the session, we'll know where we're headed. So if no one's got anything else, thank you all very much. You guys have a good afternoon.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you. Thank you.